Get the gold. Forget the pyramids, the temples, the myths of luxury. Forget the Hollywood images of half-naked servants feeding grapes to a smirking ruler reclining in shade. Let's start the day not as an outsider peeking into Egyptian glory, but as the pharaoh himself. And let me tell you right away, being the living god on earth sucked. The sun is not even up yet, and your day begins. You are Pharaoh, the divine ruler, the living embodiment of Horus, protector of Ma'at, chosen by the gods to uphold balance and cosmic order. That sounds grand, until you realize what it actually means. You cannot sneeze without it becoming symbolic. You cannot yawn without someone wondering if Ra has grown weary. Your entire body, your blood, your breath, your bowels, is divine property. Priests. Oh, they're watching. Always watching. Your bedroom is silent, not because you're alone. You are never truly alone, but because silence is protocol. Servants hover like ghosts. A priest murmurs prayers while preparing ritual oils. You are not allowed to touch your own body. Everything from bathing to shaving is done to you. The water must be blessed. The blades must be ritualized. Your scent must be divine. They dress you like a statue, layer by layer, linen upon linen, perfumes made of myrrh and lotus, amulets wrapped in threads of gold, symbols of protection that you may or may not believe in. Does it matter? You must look immortal, and the moment your feet touch the floor, the weight hits. Not the weight of the crown, although that thing is heavy too, especially the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, but the weight of expectation. Thousands of people outside believe the sunrise depends on your conduct. If there's a drought, it's your fault. If the Nile doesn't flood properly, you must have displeased the gods. If a locust appears, someone blames your dreams. You haven't even had breakfast yet. And breakfast, if it comes, is not a casual affair. Food is offered in ceremony, inspected, tasted by priests or tasters, because assassination by pomegranate or poisoned honey is not unheard of. Not all palace politics are visible, and even within the walls of your court, there are smiling mouths with silent daggers. Half your siblings want your position. The other half are already buried in suspicious ways. You must remain calm, composed, radiant. Because panic is for mortals. Now let's pause for a moment and reconsider this divine position. From birth, you weren't raised by parents. You were raised by tutors, ritualists, mathematicians, scribes. You've been taught to read the stars before you knew how to run. You memorized lineage charts, prayer recitations, military strategies, and diplomatic protocols, all before you understood why the palace smelled like incense and ambition. You were never allowed to have a friend, only allies. You were groomed to be a god in a human body, and nobody ever asked if you wanted that. Imagine being a child and being told that your tantrum might anger Isis, that a misstep in your posture could doom a harvest, that your dreams might be omens for national disaster. Would you sleep well? Would you trust yourself? Now, as a grown ruler, you are not only a political figure, you are the state. Your breath is law. Your image is etched into stone. Your words become sacred texts. And all of this comes with a terrifying price. You cannot be wrong. You not doubt. You cannot break down or fall ill or whisper regrets. Because a weak God is no God at all. But you are weak. You're tired. And the more they wrap you in golden garments, the more you feel the copper tang of isolation. To the world, you are divine. But in your own mind, you are just a man locked in ritual and surveillance, pretending not to crack. Let's not forget the physical pain. All that gold you see in museums, try wearing it in 40-degree Egyptian heat. Try sitting perfectly still in ceremonial poses for 4 hours while the sun reflects off your throne and into your eyes. Try breathing through incense while maintaining a serene smile as 50 people chant your name like you're a living statue. And while you sit there, pretending to be the divine pivot of the universe, Your viziers whisper about grain shortages. Your guards speak of Nubian rebels. Your wives argue over succession rights. Your children are quietly poisoned by power. And then someone brings news. The temple construction in Thebes is behind schedule. The high priest says you must increase offerings. A sick child's parents cry for an audience, believing your presence alone can cure illness. The astronomers say there's an eclipse coming. The generals say there's movement near the Sinai. And all of it, every crop, star, child, soldier, is your problem. So, no, Pharaoh did not lounge about all day. He calculated every blink. He monitored every breath. He bore the burden of an empire balanced on belief, the most fragile currency of all. And if he failed to uphold that belief, if he stammered, bled, cried, or fell ill in public, the people would not just mourn, they would panic. Because if the God King breaks, what hope is left for the common man? Now imagine that your every waking moment is governed by a calendar older than most civilizations, and your only free thought is wondering who wants you dead this week. Because here's something they don't teach in school when you color in pyramids. Pharaohs didn't retire. They died. That was the exit strategy. The moment you wore the crown, whether you were 9 years old like Pepe II or already middle-aged after a palace coup, your life ceased to be yours. And the people around you, they weren't just courtiers or advisors. They were potential successors, which also meant they were your most urgent threat. Your brothers, political alliances, not partners. Power-hungry administrators who understood exactly how fragile your godhood was. And your own sons. Let's just say, more than a few pharaohs didn't survive their children's teenage years. You weren't just worried about war on the borders. You were worried about war in your own bedchamber. Let's talk about succession. Pharaohs had dozens of children, often with multiple wives, concubines, and in some cases, even their sisters. Yes, that happened more than once. So they disappeared. Because divine bloodlines had to remain pure. But here's the thing about purity. It gets muddy real fast when 40 people think they're the heir. And when it's time to pass the crown, there's no democratic vote, no constitutional clarity. It's chaos in linen robes. Your eldest son might expect the throne, but so might the child of your chief wife, or the charming boy raised in the temple, or the general with more soldiers than sense. And that's if you even make it to old age. So you spent every day pretending to be divine, while also second-guessing every smile in your court. That new perfume your wife gave you, better have the food taster try it first. That flattery from the high priest could be real, or could be code for, "We're replacing you." The very rituals that preserved your power also exposed your vulnerability. You were expected to attend public ceremonies regularly, festivals like Opet, where you were paraded through the city like a living idol. And you couldn't just wave from a balcony. You were hoisted on a bark under the weight of regalia, surrounded by thousands. And what if someone in the crowd, a farmer whose taxes crushed his family, a foreign spy, a cousin with unresolved ambitions, decided that this was the moment? Security was primitive. Your guards used spears, not surveillance systems. Your enemies used rumors, poisons, bribes. Death could come from anywhere. A servant's tray, a scribe's ink, a poorly timed fall off the temple steps. And you couldn't show fear. Gods don't flinch, even if your sandals were soaked in sweat. Now let's look at marriage. Or rather, let's look at power dressed as marriage. Most pharaohs didn't choose love, they chose strategy. One wife to please the high priesthood, one to secure the southern province, another because her father controls your grain supply, and one, usually your half-sister, because the bloodline requires it. Not in the slightest. You're not in love. You're in negotiation. And these women, they're not just wives. They're political players, each with their own faction, each raising sons with ambitions, each nursing dreams of becoming the great royal wife, the only one whose son would matter when you're gone. At night, your harem isn't just a place of rest. It's a labyrinth of whispers, jealousies, alliances, and very real daggers. And speaking of rest, you barely sleep. Because when the sun goes down, the rituals don't. You perform moon ceremonies. You meet with stargazers. You receive midnight messages from distant governors who swear they're loyal, but the messenger smells like he's hiding something. You pace the hallways of your palace, torch in hand, listening for something. A cough in the shadows. A servant's misstep. A cat that wasn't supposed to be there. You don't trust your own shadow. And while all this unfolds behind palace walls, the empire never stops needing you. The scribes demand new laws. The granaries are short again. A flood destroyed 3 villages. A tomb collapsed near the Valley of the Kings, and now the locals whisper about cursed ancestors. But you cannot collapse. You cannot age. You cannot panic. You cannot even sneeze too loudly, lest the omens be read wrong. Because this empire isn't built on stones and hieroglyphs. It's built on belief. And if they stop believing in you, they won't just mourn you. They'll bury you in silence. And your name, once carved into temples and gold, will be scratched out. As if you never lit it. You might think that being a pharaoh meant that, at the very least, you could die in peace. That after all the rituals, the sacrifices, the unbearable heat beneath the weight of divine expectations, you'd be granted a final reward, a peaceful death followed by eternal glory. But let me tell you a cruel little secret about ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were more afraid of death than almost anyone. Not death itself, perhaps, but the consequences of not being remembered. In a land where the afterlife was your true life, the real terror wasn't dying. It was being forgotten. Oblivion was worse than hell, because if your name was erased, if your tomb was desecrated, if the proper spells weren't said, then your soul, your Ka, would wander forever in darkness. Let's start with your tomb. You've been planning it since the day you took the throne. Actually, no, since the day your father took the throne. Because even as a boy, you were already being sized up for a sarcophagus. Architects were sketching, quarrymen carving, priests consulting star maps, all trying to ensure that when you died, your soul would take the proper celestial off-ramp to join Ra in the sky. But here's the catch. The more important you were, the bigger your tomb needed to be. And the bigger the tomb, the more people knew where your gold was. That was never safe in Egypt. You might imagine that the Valley of the Kings was sacred. It wasn't. It was a graveyard. And graveyards in every era attract thieves. So you built secret passageways, fake tunnels, false walls. You ordered your name to be hidden in cryptic scripts. You assigned loyal guards. You had the entrance sealed with curses. But in the back of your mind, you always knew one day someone would come with a chisel, not to honor you, but to rob you, to crack open your coffin, to strip the amulets from your chest, to toss your carefully embalmed body aside in search of more lucrative treasures. All that effort, all that fear, for a tomb you'd never get to sleep peacefully in. Because even death was competitive. If your tomb was humble, people would whisper that your reign had been weak. If your tomb was grand but looted, it meant the gods had not protected you. And if your tomb was found, even thousands of years later, and it was empty, then history might mistake you for a nobody. So you see, Pharaoh's work didn't end with death. It began again in death, in the form of bureaucratic immortality. You had to ensure that your name was chanted during festivals, that your statues remained standing, that the temple priests still got their donations to perform rituals in your honor centuries after you were dust, and you had to trust your descendants. Yes, the same ones you never trusted while alive, to preserve your legacy. Imagine dying and knowing that your immortality now rested in the hands of your least ambitious son and a team of underpaid priests. Not exactly comforting, but wait, it gets worse. You weren't just buried with treasure, you were buried with people, sometimes servants, sometimes guards, sometimes lovers. In earlier dynasties, this meant literal sacrifice, people entombed alive or killed in preparation, just so they could serve you in the next world. Later, when that practice faded, we replaced bodies with figurines, the famous ushaptis, little statues meant to work for you in the afterlife. You'd be buried with hundreds, each one carved with names, spells, tasks. Because even in death, Pharaoh was expected to work. Building, managing divine duties. No rest for the once living God. And what if something went wrong in the embalming? Let me paint the scene. You've died. The embalming priest makes a mistake. Perhaps your heart, which was never supposed to be removed, the seat of the soul in Egyptian belief, is accidentally discarded, or stolen, or lost. Now you arrive in the Hall of Judgment before Osiris, god of the dead, and they place your heart on the scale against the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth. But without a heart, without the right spells, your soul is eaten by Amit, the devourer, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile. No immortality, just nothingness. This is the horror that stalked pharaohs more than any war, that their death rites would be botched, that someone would forget to speak the right words, that a worker would steal the wrong necklace, that a curse would fail to trigger, that time itself would forget their name. You want to know how much that fear mattered? Some pharaohs ordered their names carved 100 feet high into cliff walls. Some flooded the temples with their statues, just so their image would last through sandstorms and time. Some, like Ramses II, went so far with it that later kings had to erase parts of his name just to make space for their own. Because in Egypt, the real throne wasn't stone, it was melody, and pharaohs spent their entire lives trying to cling to it, even when they were no longer alive. So far, we've talked about the burden of being divine, the paranoia of palace life, and the terror of being forgotten in death. But let's come down from the symbolism for a moment and talk about something more. Let's talk about what it was like to live in your own body as Pharaoh, and how even that sucked. Because beneath all the golden masks, linen wrappings, and lotus perfume, Pharaoh was still a man. And men are made of flesh, flesh that gets sick, flesh that breaks down, flesh that bleeds and rots. No matter how many gods you're named after, start with your teeth. Egyptian bread was famously hard. Ground with sandstone grit, it was filled with microscopic particles that eroded enamel like sandpaper. Even the wealthy, even Pharaoh, ground their teeth down to stubs by middle age. Examinations of royal mummies showed tooth abscesses, infections, broken molars, and rotted gums. In the land of gold, pain was constant, and there were no dentists. Imagine ruling an empire while every word you speak vibrates through a decaying jaw. Imagine smiling for a festival while pus oozes from an infected molar. You're the god king of the Nile, and your breath could knock out a camel. Then there's the climate. Egypt is hot. The sun isn't gentle, it's relentless. The desert doesn't forgive. You're wrapped in heavy linen, layered in jewelry, topped with crowns that trap heat like ovens. Sweat is a daily companion, and skin infections aren't rare. Parasites love royal flesh just as much as common. The Nile brought life, yes, but it also brought mosquitoes, schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease that inflamed the bladder and kidneys. Many pharaohs likely peed blood. Some limped from hip infections. Some couldn't stand upright for ceremonies, but they had to, because gods don't limp. And then, of course, there were the hereditary deformities. You remember how pharaohs often married their sisters. That wasn't just a myth. To keep the bloodline pure, generations of royal families practiced endogamy. And what happens when you marry your sister's daughter's cousin's son? You get twisted genetics. Archaeologists have found signs of congenital disorders in royal remains: clubbed feet, fused vertebrae, scoliosis. Some pharaohs may have had epilepsy. Others were likely infertile, impotent, or plagued by chronic fatigue. And none of that could be shown to the people. So they painted your statues taller than you were. They carved your face to look symmetrical, even if it wasn't. They commissioned images of you smiting enemies, even when you could barely walk up the palace steps. Now, let's talk surgery. Egypt was advanced in many ways. They had medical papyri, trained physicians, herbal treatments. But when it came to actual surgery, real internal intervention, things got dangerous fast. No anesthesia. No antibiotics. If you developed appendicitis, a tumor, or internal bleeding, you played. Actually, others prayed. You just died. Even mummification wasn't as glamorous as it looks in documentaries. When your time came, your organs were removed through slits in the body, hooked out through the nose, pulled like rope, and placed in jars. Your skin dried and shrank. Your body was packed like an old suitcase and painted to look divine. But what if you survived all that? The abscesses, the parasites, the deformities. Then came aging. And pharaohs did not age gracefully. In fact, they weren't expected to age at all. You were supposed to look eternal. So when your hair thinned, they glued wigs to your scalp. When your spine curved, they had you sit behind taller chairs to hide it. When your eyes clouded with cataracts, you were lit by torchlight to avoid showing it in public. You were aging, and nobody was allowed to acknowledge it. Worse, you couldn't complain. Pain was seen as weakness. Gods didn't whine about their backs. They didn't groan when standing up. They didn't need help walking down the temple stairs. So you pretended. And the more you pretended, the more you suffered in silence. Because if anyone saw you falter, really falter, the illusion would crack. The empire would whisper, and your enemies would smile. Behind every statue of a proud, square-jawed pharaoh was a man with calloused feet, crooked teeth, and a bladder infection. And no one ever dared say it out loud. Let's step away from the ceremonies, the parasites, and the pressure for a moment. Let's ask a simple question. Did Pharaoh ever get to laugh? Not the ceremonial smile carved into limestone, not the performative chuckle during a temple festival. I mean real laughter. The kind that sneaks up on you. The kind you share with people who truly know you. Now consider this. Who could laugh with a god? Because Pharaoh had no equals. That was the whole point. You were above your court, above your family, above nature itself. The divine order of Ma'at placed you between gods and men, too holy for the peasantry, too elevated for your own siblings. You were the sun incarnate. But even the sun, when it sets, is alone. There was no one to confide in, no best friend, no drinking buddy, no one you could say, "I'm scared," to without it becoming political suicide. Everything you said was a decree. Every gesture was a message. Every moment of softness could be interpreted as weakness. You were a man surrounded by hundreds of people, and yet completely, hopelessly alone. Even your children were trained to bow before you. They were told to revere you, not to know you. Their love was structured, filtered through hierarchy and superstition. You didn't tuck them in at night. You didn't go fishing with them on the Nile. If you were lucky, you nodded at them during a festival. If they were lucky, you remembered their name. Your wives weren't partners. They were rivals. Each one hoping her son would replace you. Each one maintaining a polished smile, even while sending spies to watch the others. Every bedroom had ears. Every hallway had whispers. The very air around you seemed to hum with ambition, and yet you still had to play your role. Each morning you appeared before the priests. You made offerings. You recited lines about your divine wisdom, your unshakable will, your perfect balance. You nodded as they praised your virtue. You watched as they burned incense and bowed. And you said nothing, because if you spoke too freely, Even to a trusted advisor, that trust could be sold by sunset. Pharaoh was not allowed to vent. Pharaoh was not allowed to cry. Even your dreams had to be interpreted by temple officials, not as personal reflections, but as state omens. Maybe you dreamed about your mother or being chased, but you couldn't say it like a man. You had to describe it in riddles. Let others decode you, because even your sleep belonged to the kingdom. Now, did Pharaoh ever leave the palace? And never alone. Every outing was orchestrated, from royal hunts to temple tours. Soldiers' information, scribes recording every step, priests scattering sand, so your divine feet wouldn't touch dirt. Crowds shouted praises you didn't believe. Musicians played songs you didn't choose. And all the while, you were paraded like a statue with blood. Even your meals were eaten under watchful eyes, not just to ensure you weren't poisoned, though that was part of it, but to ensure you maintained the image. You couldn't pick at your food like a tired man. You had to eat like the Nile itself fed your appetite. You couldn't even die in private. When the pharaoh was near death, entire households entered a strange dance of silence and denial. No one said the word. No one acknowledged the failing health. Instead, priests intensified rituals. Scribes prepared declarations. Embalmers hovered nearby, pretending they weren't measuring your arms for a coffin. And all the while, you remained isolated, not just from people, but from truth. Because in Egypt, the truth about Pharaoh was always hidden, even from himself. You might have longed for a moment of honesty, just one night where someone sat with you, not as a subject, not as a servant, not as a spy, but as a human being. But such moments didn't exist. You were sacred, and sacred things are not embraced. They are worshipped from a distance. Behind your mask of gold was a man who had never heard a joke told without a purpose, a man who hadn't heard his real name, the one only his mother whispered, in decades. A man who couldn't remember the last time someone looked him in the eye without trembling. That's the curse of being divine. You are never allowed to be simply alive. Let's talk about something heavy now. Heavier than any crown, heavier than the guilt of being worshipped, even heavier than the golden sarcophagus waiting for you at the end. Let's talk about what it means to carry an empire. Because Egypt wasn't just a collection of temples and sand. It was a beast, vast, ancient, hungry. It stretched from the Mediterranean delta to the cataracts of Nubia. And every part of it, every mud brick and grain of barley, every priest's whisper and peasant's harvest was your responsibility. As pharaoh, you didn't just rule the land. You were the land. The Nile flowed because you allowed it. The sun rose because you maintained ma'at, divine balance. And if something went wrong, crops failed, storms came, enemies invaded, tombs collapsed. It was your fault, always your fault. Not in the modern sense of political blame, but in the cosmic sense. You had failed the universe. Every day was a test of stability. Every hour was a balancing act between famine and abundance, chaos and order, betrayal and obedience. You were expected to uphold an invisible contract with the gods. And everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest scribe, was watching to see if the world was still in harmony. And harmony was. Let's talk economics. The priests didn't work for free. The temples needed incense, livestock, rare woods, imported oils. The scribes wanted new papyrus. The soldiers needed pay and horses and bronze-tipped weapons from across the desert. The royal artisans, busy carving your name into eternity, had their own families to feed. And where did it all come from? Relentless, grinding taxes. Cattle, grain, labor, linen, everything had a tax. And the officials who collected them. They were brutal. You might not have whipped the peasants personally, but your treasury depended on men who did. And every year, they came knocking on door after door, pulling offerings from homes barely big enough to stand in. So yes, Pharaoh built temples, but he did it with sweat he'd never seen and blood he pretended not to notice. Now think about your inbox, or rather, your scribes, who brought news every morning. A shipment of cedar has gone missing near Byblos. There's talk of unrest in Thebes. The Nubian frontier is tense again. The nomads of the Sinai are raiding grain stores. The Hittites are sending envoys, or spies who can tell. The sacred crocodile in Kamombo is sick, and the priests say it's a bad omen. Meanwhile, the granaries report shortages. The Nile didn't flood as high this year, and someone poisoned the well in the delta. They whispered apologies no one else would ever hear. Nobody knows, but it's spreading rumors, and the rumors are spreading fear. What do? You hold it all in. You gather your viziers, your generals, your astronomers. You write letters to distant governors with the elegance of calm control. You send gifts to allies, threats to enemies, and lies to everyone else. Because Pharaoh can never say, "I don't know." Pharaoh must always know, even when you don't, especially when you don't. And let's not forget the seasons. Each year, the Nile had to flood. That was the basis of everything, the sacred rhythm of silt and water that kept Egypt alive. But the Nile was unpredictable. Too low and crops failed. Too high and villages drowned. And if the priests began to sense the gods were unhappy, or the people began to murmur about omens, you had to act. Public works. New statues. You had to remind everyone that Ma'at was intact, that you still held the center of the world, even if, inside, you felt like it was already breaking, even if you hadn't slept in 3 days, even if your own guards whispered that your son was plotting against you, because Pharaoh doesn't falter, not in the face of rebellion, not in the face of drought, not in the face of fear. You are the point upon which the universe turns, or so they say. But the truth, you are one man, on a throne too wide for any human soul, wearing a crown built to crush, and it's only day 3 of the festival. You might think that being the chosen of the gods would come with some perks. Divine favor, miraculous protection, maybe a few holy visions to guide your decisions. But in ancient Egypt, religion wasn't a luxury for Pharaoh, it was a prison. A beautifully carved, incense-filled, symbol-laden prison. You were both its warden and its most important inmate. From the moment of your coronation, your entire existence was shackled to the divine. Every breath you took was supposed to be in accordance with Ma'at, the balance between chaos and order. But here's the twist. Ma'at wasn't just a spiritual ideal. It was state policy. You weren't just expected to be pious. You were expected to embody religion. That meant daily rituals. No, not just prayers. I'm talking hours of ceremonial duty every single morning. Before the sun had even warmed the courtyard tiles, you were being washed, oiled, robed, painted, and marched into the temple to awaken the gods. But it never was. You had to wake the gods. You'd enter the sanctuary, alone, but watched by priests. You'd open the doors of the shrine, unveil the statue of the deity, offer food, incense, and chants, then seal the chamber again. And you'd do this every day, not once, but for every major god in your portfolio. Which, if you were a pharaoh like Ramses, could mean over a dozen temples. You'd think a god king could delegate. Because if you didn't perform the ritual personally, the gods might get. And if they were offended, the Nile might not flood, the crops might wither, the sun might rise late, the next solar eclipse might be blamed on your laziness. So you obeyed. You prayed. You poured offerings you didn't believe in anymore. You memorized hymns that made your mouth ache, all because if you stopped, your people might starve. And religion wasn't passive. It washed you back. The priesthood, especially the cults of Amun, Ra, and Osiris, were powerful beyond imagination. They controlled land, temples, entire provinces. In some cases, they had more money than the royal treasury, and they were very aware that your divinity was a matter of public relations. If you made a misstep, they could declare it a sign. If you took a wrong vow, they could say the gods disapproved. If you raised taxes, they could say a dream revealed your corruption. And the worst part, you couldn't oppose them openly because you needed them to maintain your own image. It was an unholy alliance. They pretended you were divine, and you pretended they weren't manipulating the throne. Now imagine being Pharaoh and secretly losing your faith. Imagine watching your people suffer while you offered prayers that never worked. Imagine walking past rows of the sick and the starving on your way to bless golden statues that never blinked. But you couldn't say anything. You couldn't question the gods, because your power was the gods. You had to stand in front of your people during the great Opet festival, with horns blaring, dancers spinning, the sacred barki floating down the Nile, and pretend that your heart wasn't hollow, that you still believed, that you weren't just playing dress-up with eternity. Sometimes, late at night, you might sneak out to the roof of the palace. Look at the stars. Ask yourself if any of this was real. If Ra was truly sailing across the sky. If Anubis really weighed the hearts of the dead. If anyone was actually listening. And the wind would answer. And the wind never said anything. Yet come morning, you descend again, head high, draped in linen and lapis, ready to perform the rites. Because faith wasn't a personal journey for you. It was a performance. It was policy. It was politics. And the cost of even a moment of honesty. Because if Pharaoh lost faith, then what would the people believe in? Let's stop pretending Pharaoh ruled in peace. Sure, we like to think of ancient Egypt as a land of calm reflection, temples rising in harmony with the sun, farmers harvesting grain under the protection of the Nile, scribes quietly transcribing the secrets of the gods. But behind that postcard image was something far messier, because even a god king could not rule without war. Egypt may have been built on the Nile, but it was defended by blood. Rebellion, invasion, betrayal. These weren't the exception. They were the rhythm of your reign. And every time peace threatened to settle, someone, somewhere, picked up a spear. Now, let's look at Pharaoh in battle. You've probably seen those reliefs. The great Pharaoh driving his chariot through rows of enemies, bow drawn, lion at his side, with tiny figures scrambling in fear before him. But let me tell you a truth. Those reliefs don't show. Pharaoh probably wasn't even there. At least not like that. War was mostly handled by generals. Pharaoh might ride out to inspect the army, to appear during the opening stages of a campaign, or to oversee victory celebrations. But the actual chaos of the front lines, the screaming, the plague that followed the wounded, that was for us. And yet, if Egypt lost the battle, it was your fault. The gods had turned against you. So even when you weren't at war, you were preparing for it. Fortifying borders, building chariots, training boys to become soldiers, making diplomatic marriages with foreign princesses who hated the heat and never learned your language. And when war had come, you became a mascot of violence. Priests would anoint your weapons. Scribes would write heroic hymns about your strength. Artists would pre-carve victory walls before the battle was even won, just in case. And when the enemy surrendered, you had to put on a show, marching prisoners through the city, sacrificing their leaders, carving their names onto your sandals, literally, so every step you took was on the neck of your enemies. But if the enemy didn't surrender, then you had to go again, and again, because a pharaoh who didn't win was not a pharaoh at all. And war wasn't your only battlefield. Rebellion brewed constantly within the kingdom. Some priest somewhere always wanted more land. Some noble thought your cousin would make a better ruler. Some peasant village decided they'd rather starve on their own terms than be taxed to death. And rebellion had to be crushed publicly. because the illusion of order was more important than order itself. You couldn't let a village get away with disobedience. You couldn't let a governor speak too freely. You couldn't let whispers turn into slogans or slogans into crowds. So you sent men. You burned crops. You hanged a few troublemakers on the palace gates. You buried the rest in state silence. And then you commissioned a new hymn to Ma'at, praising the return of balance. That's the other thing. Pharaoh didn't get to feel guilt. You couldn't cry over the 100 men who died building your fortress. You couldn't flinch when you signed a decree that wiped out a rebel village. You couldn't say, maybe this is too much, because divine kings don't feel too much, even if the actions haunt them in dreams, even if you can still see the eyes of that child you sentenced, even if your hands shake when no one is looking, and even if war did not come in the form of spears and swords, it came economically. Economic collapse. You had to manage the chaos like a general without an army. You had to command the skies without wings. And every crisis made your throne wobble. Because people only believed in you when life was stable. When the Nile flooded right. When the granaries were full. When the stars didn't shift too strangely in the night. If the world started to fall apart, so did their belief in you, and Pharaoh could survive war. But he couldn't survive doubt. You'd think that if a pharaoh accomplished anything in his life, conquered enemies, held the Nile in balance, built temples, produced heirs, he could rest. He could rest. But rest was never part of the deal. Not in life, not in death. Because Pharaoh was not only expected to rule, he was expected to endure. And nothing screams forever quite like a monument. Every pharaoh became obsessed with one question: how will they remember me? And that question burned day and night, because in Egypt, to be forgotten was to die a second time. So you built columns of stone taller than any tree, with your name chiseled so deep that sand and wind couldn't erase it. Every monument was a message to the future. I mattered. I was here. I was divine. But there was a problem with building in stone. Stone costs blood. The Great Pyramid. That wasn't a feat of magic. It was a feat of state and forced exhaustion. Tens of thousands of workers, farmers during the off-season, slaves, forced laborers, dragging limestone across the desert. Men crushed under falling blocks. Boys losing fingers. Whole families torn apart for generations, just so one king could rest beneath a pile of rocks with a straight edge. And you oversaw every stage. You approved blueprints. You met with architects. You personally blessed the first stones, inspected the workforce, watched the rising walls with a mix of awe and anxiety. Because it wasn't just about size. It was about outdoing the last guy. If your tomb was smaller than your father's, weakness. If your statues didn't reach the height of Ramses's, if your name wasn't inscribed on every obelisk from Memphis to Thebes. So you pushed harder, ordered new construction, reallocated grain from starving regions to feed your workforce, maybe even taxed the priesthood, just enough to keep them quiet, but enough to fuel one more temple. And you never stopped. Because eternity, it turns out, is exhausting. And then came the artists. You weren't just building stone, you were building your image. Every statue had to be perfect. Muscles idealized, posture confident. You may have had a hunched back and tooth decay in life, but in limestone, you were a god, calm and fierce, forever youthful. Your real body would rot, but your stone body, that had to endure. Of course, not all pharaohs had the time or funds to build monuments. Some died too young. Others lost wars, or suffered famines, or were overthrown in their statues. In Egypt, erasure was the cruelest punishment. It didn't just kill your memory, it unmade your soul. So you spent fortunes to protect your legacy. You had your name carved and recopied thousands of times. You sponsored festivals just to remind the people of your greatness. You retold battles in 10 different ways, each one more glorious than the last. You weren't just a king, you were a brand. And the more you feared being forgotten, the more you lied to stone. Even your tombs, sealed and secret, were filled with painted walls describing your valor, your wisdom, your blessings from Ra. Exaggerations, certainly. But the hope was simple. If I can control the story, I can survive time. Except time doesn't play fair. Temples crumble, sands bury tombs, and one day your name is misread by a priest, then forgotten by a scribe, then lost entirely. And suddenly, you're nothing. You, the ruler of the world, outlived by a potter's shard in the desert. We like to think that pharaohs ruled until their last breath, regal and divine, fading into gold-covered tombs surrounded by incense and song. But the truth is darker and more common than you'd think, because many pharaohs didn't die in peace. They were betrayed, and worse, they were forgotten. The throne of Egypt wasn't a solid seat of power. It was a pedestal built on sand, and the higher you rose, the more unstable it became. Enemies didn't always come with spears. Sometimes they came as cousins, and they smiled, bowed, praised your wisdom, right up until the moment they slipped the knife in. Egypt had its share of palace coups. Pharaohs poisoned, strangled, cut down in dark corridors, their names immediately stripped from records, their monuments repurposed by the next regime. The divine king reduced to a historical gap, or worse, rebranded. Some pharaohs were accused of heresy after death. Take Akhenaten, for example, the king who dared challenge the priesthood by introducing a single god, Aten. After his death, the priests and politicians moved fast. They smashed his statues, buried his city, erased his name. For centuries, we didn't even know he existed. Imagine ruling with conviction, believing you were changing the world, only to be buried not just in stone, but in silence. And that silence, it spreads because Pharaoh's power was never as absolute as it seemed. When the economy collapsed, when the Nile failed, when trade dried up, when food ran out, belief dried up with it. Belief dried up with it. Suddenly, the same people who once bowed at your feet begin to murmur. Maybe the gods are angry. Maybe Pharaoh has lost favor. Maybe someone else should rule. You start to notice changes. Fewer offerings in the temples. Priests showing up late for rituals. Officials forgetting to enforce your decrees. Governors sending fewer messages, or worse, sending armies. You can't stop it. You're still stuck in rituals. Still blessing statues. Still ordering gold leaf on tomb walls while the world cracks beneath you. And even if you see it coming, what can you do? Purge the court. That might backfire. Shore up military loyalty. That costs grain, and you're already out. Make alliances. There's no one left to trust. And the people, the thousands who once cheered your name during festivals, now look away. They lowered their eyes. They speak of omens. They dream of other names. And if you die during this spiral, your successor inherits an empire already half in ruin. If he's lucky, he restores some order. If he's not, the dynasty ends. The tombs are looted. The monuments fall. And all your efforts, all the pain, the fear, the pressure, turn to dust. Just another broken statue in the desert. And even if the kingdom limps on, you're forgotten, your name lost to the sand, until one day, thousands of years later, some archaeologist mispronounces it while brushing dirt off your bones. And that throne you bled for, it's sitting beneath a museum light, next to a placard that reads, Unknown Pharaoh circa 1300 BCE. You'd think that after carrying the weight of an empire, after being devoured by duty, paranoia, and ritual, after enduring toothaches, betrayal, and sleepless nights, finally, you'd get some rest. But Pharaoh never really rested, because even in death, he was still being used. Let's revisit your tomb. It's sealed now. Your mummified body rests in a golden coffin, surrounded by amulets, spells, jars of your organs, and figurines carved to work for you in the afterlife. The walls are painted with scenes of you worshipping the gods, triumphing in battle, receiving the eternal embrace of Osiris. But above ground, the world moves on, and what happens next is not divine. Sometimes it starts small. A priest is paid a little extra gold to borrow a sacred artifact. A worker, hungry and underpaid, preys off a gemstone from your sarcophagus. A scribe, angry about his treatment, scratches your name from a wall. The rot begins. Tomb robbing wasn't rare in ancient Egypt. It was common, inevitable. Even the greatest kings, Seti I, Ramses II, Tutankhamun, were not spared. Entire tombs were ransacked during periods of political collapse. Mummies were torn from their coffins, gold stolen, sacred objects smashed or sold. Some pharaohs were found centuries later, stripped naked, dumped into anonymous pits, their identities erased. That's the final insult. Because, remember, for the ancient Egyptians, to be remembered was to exist. Every prayer, every offering, every annual mention of your name, all of it kept your soul alive in the field of reeds, the heavenly mirror of Egypt. No name, no soul. And what if, instead of looting, the priesthood decided to reuse your tomb? Maybe they ran out of space. Maybe politics changed. Maybe your legacy wasn't convenient anymore. So they take your beautiful golden coffin and recycle it for another ruler. They scrape off your name, paint over your image, tuck your shroud into a corner, no longer a god, just clutter. In some cases, it wasn't even that subtle. Pharaohs like Horemheb straight up replaced their predecessors, took their statues, their inscriptions, their titles, and made them their own. The gods didn't seem to complain. And the people, well, they believed what they were told. So you, once the divine shepherd of Egypt, became a footnote, a broken name on a chipped wall, a mummy in a museum box labeled unidentified remains. But maybe, just maybe, you were lucky. Maybe your tomb stayed hidden. Maybe robbers never found it. Maybe centuries passed and the desert swallowed your memory in silence rather than in violence. But now your ghost wanders. Because here's the final truth, the afterlife. It wasn't guaranteed. It depended on being maintained. People had to keep your name alive. Temples had to honor your rituals. Scribes had to recite their victories. Without that infrastructure, without belief, you were just dead. So imagine being Pharaoh and watching as your priests forget you. Watching as your temples are converted or abandoned. Watching as people pronounce your name wrong or not at all. Watching as a foreign empire comes, laughs at your gods, and breaks your statues for fun. They'll gate everything. You bled for Egypt. And Egypt forgot, because in the end, even the divine are disposable. You walked through a museum. The lights are soft, the air controlled, the halls quiet. And there, rising before you, is a statue of a pharaoh. Calm gaze, perfect symmetry, arms crossed, holding the crook and flail, symbols of divine authority. You stand there, impressed. This was a god, a king, a ruler of men and time, a giant who left monuments standing long after empires fell. But none of that is true. That statue, flawless and serene, is a lie. It doesn't tell you about the ulcers in his stomach or the rot in his gums. It doesn't tell you about the loneliness that clawed at him during sleepless nights in a marble hall full of whispers. It doesn't mention the brother who plotted against him, the priest who blackmailed him, or the wife who prayed her son would inherit sooner rather than later. It doesn't tell you that he was terrified of eclipses, that he flinched when birds flew the wrong way, that he wept once, in private, after executing a child accused of treason, that he wondered if the gods he worshipped ever truly listened, or if they, too, were stone and silence. It doesn't show the layers of linen that bound his body so tight in death that his spine cracked. It doesn't show the men who tore open his tomb, dumped his body in the sand, and sold his amulets for 2 sacks of barley and a goatskin. It doesn't show that, for centuries, no one knew his name. What it shows is power. What it hides is fear. And that is the real curse of Pharaoh. Not snakes or tomb traps or dusty incantations carved in forgotten script. The curse was being believed to be more than human, believed to be flawless, believed to be divine. Because once you are believed to be perfect, there is no space left for failure, grief, or pain. No room for love, for error, for small joys. Only performance. Only pressure. You wither the crown. You hold the crook. You bless the flood. You smile as they bow. And you do it knowing that one day soon, they will turn you into a statue. But nothing like you. And centuries later, a child will point to your stone face in a museum, ask their parent, who was he? And the answer will be simple. He was a king. They'll never know that it hurt, that it cost everything, that being Pharaoh was one of the loneliest jobs in human history.